Throughout history, few spiritual testimonies have described the afterlife with as much detail, sobriety, and consistency as the diary of Saint Maria Faustina Kowalska. Written in the early 20th century, her diary does not read like legend or folklore. It reads like an eyewitness account, measured, restrained, and deeply unsettling. What makes it remarkable is not what it dramatizes, but what it quietly reveals. This is not a story about fear. It is a revelation about mercy. According to Saint Faustina, Jesus did not speak about purgatory as a place reserved for the worst sinners. On the contrary, what he showed her challenged one of the most common assumptions among believers, that purgatory is only for those who lived recklessly or disobediently. What Jesus revealed was far more disturbing and far more hopeful. In her writings, Faustina repeatedly emphasizes that many souls who end up in purgatory were faithful people, people who prayed, people who loved God, people who lived moral lives, people who died in God's grace. And yet they were not ready to enter heaven. This is the central revelation few truly believe. Jesus explained to Faustina that purgatory is not the destination of rebellion, but of incomplete transformation. These are souls who belong to God, but not entirely. Souls who loved Him sincerely, but selectively. Souls who avoided mortal sin, but carried subtle attachments, quiet self-love, unresolved wounds, and unfinished surrender. One of the most striking moments in her diary describes how Jesus allowed her to understand this reality without exaggeration or threat. She writes, "I understood how much the soul must be purified before it can enter the presence of God." Diary 20. The tone is not fearful, it is factual, almost clinical. From a documentary perspective, this challenges a simplified moral narrative. Purgatory, as Jesus explained it to Faustina, is not a punishment for wrongdoing, but the inevitable consequence of encountering absolute holiness while still carrying traces of imperfection. Jesus told her that nothing impure can remain in the presence of God, not because God rejects the soul, but because the soul itself cannot endure that light until it is fully transformed. In other words, purgatory exists not because God withholds heaven, but because heaven is too real to be entered halfway. This explains why so many people misunderstand purgatory. They imagine it as a lesser hell. Jesus showed Faustina something entirely different, a place of intense longing, certainty of salvation, and painful purification driven by love, not fear. In one passage, Faustina records Jesus saying that souls in purgatory suffer most because they already know God's beauty and long for Him with their entire being. Their pain comes from delay, not doubt, from nearness, not separation, from love that is finally undivided, yet not fully free. This is where the revelation becomes uncomfortable. If purgatory is filled not with hardened sinners, but with sincere believers who simply did not allow grace to complete its work on earth, then the question is no longer about who deserves heaven, but about who is ready for it. And that question, Jesus showed Saint Faustina, concerns far more people than most are willing to admit. As Saint Faustina continued recording what Jesus revealed to her, a pattern emerged, one that quietly dismantles the comforting illusion that being a good person is the same as being fully prepared for heaven. Again and again, Jesus emphasized that purgatory is not filled with souls who rejected God, but with souls who postponed Him. This distinction is critical. In her diary, Faustina explains that Jesus showed her souls who genuinely loved Him, yet carried unresolved attachments from earthly life, not grave sins, not public scandals, but subtle bonds, self-reliance, hidden resentment, quiet pride, delayed forgiveness, a reluctance to surrender completely. These attachments were invisible on earth, but unbearable in the presence of divine holiness. She writes, "I saw souls suffering terribly, but they were full of peace and joy because they knew they were saved." Diary 20. That sentence alone dismantles many misconceptions. These souls are not afraid of judgment. They are certain of salvation. Their suffering comes from something far more precise, the painful clarity of seeing how much they still need to be purified. From a historical perspective, this revelation reframes purgatory entirely. Jesus did not present it as a divine courtroom, but as a place of transformation, where love finishes what life left incomplete. According to Faustina, the souls there understand, with painful honesty, what they failed to surrender while alive. Jesus showed her that many of these souls lived respectable lives. They prayed regularly. They avoided serious sin. They were admired by others, yet they negotiated with grace instead of abandoning themselves to it. They gave God much, but not everything. Faustina records Jesus saying that the soul must be entirely purified of the slightest attachment before it can see my face. Diary, paraphrased from early entries. This reveals something few people truly believe. Heaven does not accept partial love, not because God is demanding, but because heaven itself is absolute. One of the most striking elements in Faustina's testimony is how ordinary these souls appear. There is no suggestion that purgatory is reserved for those who lived recklessly. Instead, it is populated by people who delayed conversion, postponed generosity, resisted interior change, or clung quietly to comfort, reputation, or control. In one passage, Faustina writes that Jesus lamented how many souls settle for mediocrity, mistaking moral decency for total surrender. They live close to God but never fully in Him. This almost holiness becomes the soul's unfinished work. From a documentary lens, this raises an unsettling question. If purgatory is filled with sincere believers who simply did not allow grace to complete its work, then purgatory is not the exception, it is the norm. Jesus showed Faustina that purgatory exists because mercy refuses to abandon the soul, even when the soul failed to abandon itself to God while alive. The fire of purgatory is not vengeance. It is truth finally embraced without resistance. This revelation forces a re-evaluation of spiritual life. The question is no longer whether someone believed, prayed, or obeyed. The question becomes whether the soul allowed itself to be transformed completely. And according to what Jesus told Saint Faustina, many did not, until it was no longer possible to delay. As Faustina's testimony unfolds, one detail becomes increasingly clear. The suffering of purgatory is not rooted in fear of condemnation, but in the sudden, irreversible clarity of truth. Jesus showed her that when the soul leaves the body, it no longer negotiates with reality. There are no excuses, no distractions, no delays. What the soul truly is becomes fully visible, especially to itself. Faustina writes that souls in purgatory understand their state with absolute certainty. They do not question God's justice. They do not protest their purification. Instead, they agree with it. This is one of the most difficult aspects for modern audiences to accept. According to her diary, purgatory is not imposed on the soul against its will. It is embraced by the soul once it finally sees itself in the light of God's holiness. In one passage, Faustina notes that the souls suffer because they see God's holiness clearly and recognize all that still separates them from Him. A diary, thematic synthesis from early entries. This recognition is not abstract, it is intimate and personal. The soul remembers every moment when it could have forgiven and did not, every time it could have trusted and chose control instead, every attachment it justified, every grace it postponed. From a historical and theological standpoint, this aligns with a consistent theme in Faustina's writings. Mercy does not erase truth. It reveals it gently, but completely. Jesus showed her that many souls reach purgatory, not because they lived in open rebellion, but because they lived in spiritual delay. They postponed surrender. They waited for later. They assumed there would always be more time. One of the most striking lines in the diary captures this reality with devastating simplicity. Faustina records Jesus saying that souls often fail to become saints, not because they lack grace, but because they do not cooperate with it. Grace was offered, help was given, opportunities appeared, but the soul hesitated. In purgatory, hesitation ends. Faustina describes the purification as intense because the soul now loves God without division. On earth, love is mixed with self-interest, fear, pride, and comfort. In purgatory, love becomes pure, and that purity makes every remaining imperfection painful. Not because God inflicts pain, but because love itself demands truth. This explains why, according to Jesus, purgatory is filled with souls who were good by human standards. They were not hypocrites, they were not faithless, they were unfinished. Their tragedy was not sin, it was incompleteness. From a documentary perspective, this reframes purgatory as a mirror held up to earthly life. It reveals what happens when spiritual growth is postponed, when conversion is partial, when surrender is conditional. Faustina's account suggests that purgatory exists because God takes human freedom seriously, even when it delays holiness. And here lies the uncomfortable implication Jesus revealed to her. Many souls in purgatory believed they were ready. They were surprised, not by judgment but by the depth of transformation still required. This revelation strips purgatory of superstition and replaces it with something far more demanding: responsibility. Not fear-based responsibility, but the responsibility of responding fully to grace while time still exists. Because once time ends, purification continues, but choice does not. As Saint Faustina reflected on what Jesus had revealed to her, one final truth emerged with unsettling clarity. Purgatory exists not because God is unwilling to receive souls, but because souls are often unwilling to be fully changed. This distinction reshapes everything. It transforms purgatory from a place people fear into a consequence people misunderstand. In her diary, Faustina records Jesus emphasizing that divine mercy does not force transformation. It invites it. Throughout earthly life, grace knocks quietly at the door of the heart. It offers healing, detachment, forgiveness, humility, trust, but it never coerces. Jesus showed her that many souls accept grace selectively. They allow God into certain rooms of the heart while keeping others locked. On earth, this partial surrender seems harmless. In eternity, it becomes unbearable. Faustina writes that the souls in purgatory no longer resist grace. They desire purification with their whole being. What makes their suffering intense is not the purification itself, but the realization that they delayed it unnecessarily. They see with painful precision how many moments were wasted, how many small sacrifices were avoided, how many attachments were excused, how many invitations to deeper love were ignored. One passage in the diary captures this reality with stark honesty. Faustina notes that souls in purgatory suffer because they now see clearly how much they could have loved God more. Diary, thematic synthesis consistent with early visions. This suffering is not despair. It is regret, purified of bitterness. A regret that exists only because love now burns without division. From a historical and spiritual perspective, this revelation reframes the meaning of a holy life. Jesus did not show Faustina purgatory to frighten believers, but to awaken them. He revealed it as a warning rooted in compassion. The warning is simple: do not postpone holiness, do not delay surrender, do not assume that good intentions are the same as complete transformation. According to what Jesus told Faustina, purgatory is filled with souls who meant well, souls who planned to change later, souls who trusted their own goodness more than God's grace, souls who underestimated the depth of holiness required to stand in the presence of perfect love. This is why, as Faustina's diary reveals, purgatory remains one of the least believed and most misunderstood realities of the afterlife. It demands something uncomfortable, that holiness is not optional, gradual only if freely chosen, and unavoidable eventually. Jesus showed her that the tragedy is not that souls pass through purgatory. The tragedy is that they did not become saints when they still had time. Purgatory is mercy's final act, but it is also a reminder of how much grace was available on earth and left unused. As Faustina concluded her reflections, one message stood above all others. Heaven is not denied to these souls. It is delayed, and that delay exists because love, when finally seen clearly, demands completion. In the end, what Jesus told Saint Faustina about purgatory was not meant to terrify the faithful. It was meant to challenge them to live now what they will one day wish they had lived fully. Because purgatory is not where God finishes his work. It is where the soul realizes it should have let him finish sooner.